Well, good morning, everyone. After a hiatus, we are back, and we're no longer, the three amigos, but we're now the four amigos. Ron and John just returned from a month in Scotland and Ireland, and so today we're going to talk a little bit about, maybe their comparison of what's going on in small business in Scotland versus what's going on here. And I'd like to introduce us a little bit here. I'm Ray Anderson, and to my left here is Ron Burgess, who's been with us since the onset. And of course, there's Ed Lasik in the lower corner with a smile on his face. And with the C in the background is John Mills, who is our most recent member. So we're grateful to have him here. And Ron, why don't you kick us off and tell us a little bit about your thoughts on, and that's John's point. This is not a deep dive, but rather, we're going to be talking about what they saw and anecdotally about business.
Yeah, of course, this isn't a deep statistical analysis of the differences between the two or three economies. However, on the other hand, I was doing some just quick counting up of places we had been. Now, John and I and our wives split up after a couple of weeks together in Scotland. I went down to England and traveled, I don't know, in the thousands of miles, and then John spent more time over in Ireland than we did by quite a bit. But for instance, I think that we've driven through somewhere in the neighborhood of 90 villages and towns in this period of time. So it's not as though there's no exposure, or we went to Edinburgh and are giving an opinion. When you stay in 25, 30 different places that are independently owned, and you have an opportunity in most of them to be able to talk to the owners or the managers about what's going on in their particular business. And in most of those cases, we're talking about both the hotel stay business as well as a bar/restaurant business, because most of these are bed and breakfasts and or bars or small hotels in these small villages. And so you have access to the people who are running them. And we had a lot of conversations about how things are going. Brexit, how's that going? So it's not as though we're just shooting from the hip completely, but we are talking experientially here, not statistically. We do have a couple of graphs that we can chat about, maybe when the time comes up. But overall, and this is kind of interesting, because most of the places that we went, when having a conversation with someone, we spent an entire day at a particular event with about 30, 40 people, and had an opportunity to, have lunch, have dinner, spend some time with them. And in most conversations, there are almost no people who we ran into that have had as much exposure that John and I had just in 30 days in terms of traveling their own country. And that's partially because a whole lot of people from Great Britain will go to the southern part of Europe, where it's a lot cheaper to have a vacation. I would say that of the 50, 60 people that we had conversations with over this period of time, only 2 of them, for instance, had managed to go to Orkney, where John and I had an opportunity to spend a night and a couple of days. So just to give you an example, but that's true in the United States. There are an awful lot of people who have not traveled a few places here as well. And so that's the kind of exposure I think that we have. My overall sense is that things are really pretty rough in England, in Scotland, perhaps more so in England. I don't think that's the same as in Ireland. Brexit has hurt them. The opinion when I was there 5 years ago was evenly split, and that's the way the vote ended up, between pro and con leaving the EU, and now that's over and done. They've left the EU. We didn't find one person now that said it was a good idea.
Mm,
So, there's been a big shift, and I think from what I hear in the news, that's kind of the case in terms of some of the surveys as well. So, what are the issues that have been caused by that? And there's a whole lot of talk about what's going on. One of them is food, and certainly the food prices in England have soared unbelievably high by comparison. And I think John and I can testify to what it costs to go out and just have normal pub food.
mm,
It's in almost every case, I guess I would say, generally speaking, it costs more to go out and have fish and chips there than it does here.
really?
So, for instance, a typical meal might be on a menu from $12.95 to 15 or 16 or 17 pounds, which means that's about 17 to $22.
Wow.
So, that's more than we're used to. Although if you really tried hard, you could get their lowest price and our highest price, and they might come pretty close. But for the most part, that was expensive. I didn't think our housing was particularly more expensive, but we're comparing hotel rates and that sort of thing, and we're in little towns versus cities, so I'm not sure we have a good comparison there. But the food prices were definitely higher in stores, because we did stay in some B&Bs and did a little bit of our own cooking, not very much, but we had the opportunity to be in stores and look at prices. And I think that was the same basic relationship there. For the most part, things are about the same or a little bit more in almost every category, with the exception of maybe certain areas like some alcohol. For instance, Scotch is a lot cheaper, and so you want to take advantage of those few areas. What did you think, John, just in general about the overall pricing of things?
Well, I had a slightly different take. I mean, I agree with what you're saying, but what got me was the difference in the currency, because there's several types of actually money that is being used. So, in Scotland, of course, we've got the money and currency in Scotland. Forgive me, I've got all my deals here open, and I'm going to start with Ireland. In Ireland, it's euros, and of course, that's most of the southern part of Ireland is Ireland, is euros. And then we go to Northern Ireland, and it's in pounds. But the confusing thing about Northern Ireland is that they have their own version of pounds that is printed that is not acceptable in the UK, but they're equivalent. And then you have UK pounds that are there, and several people up in Northern Ireland mentioned that we're kind of the black sheep, because the English don't really want us and the Irish don't really want us. And so here we are, we love who we are, but we're kind of out there. So it is a little bit interesting where you've got a pocket full of parking money and half of it should work and it doesn't. And it's, so I'm just going back to, if you change the basis of exchange, then confusion can happen. And of course, Scotland is known for its banks. And in the past, it has been known for its banks. And I'm not sure how strong the banking system is, although I went into a couple of banks to change money and they would not do it unless you're a member of the bank. However, there's one universal that works, and that is the touch to pay. And I don't care whether you've got touch to pay, Visa, Citibank, or Chase. And we've tried all three, but they seem to work no matter where you are. Yeah. So there's this trend that's we're going to a digital or digitally enabled money transfer system. And that's going to, I think, determine a lot of how the various, because you've got Northern Ireland, you've got Ireland, and you've got Scotland, and then you've got the UK. And of course, Scotland and the UK are joined together on the same island. You just, drive a few miles south and you're in England. And so how is that going to work in the future? And Brexit's tied into the middle of that. Very political. And I think the euro-based entities seem to be doing well because they've got all this trade coming in from Europe. Who knows?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I would say that I was actually a little bit surprised that they are so far ahead of us in terms of digital, the digital use of credit cards as almost a faux currency. And it automatically takes care of this exchange rate. Now you could argue, yeah, well, we're kind of getting screwed on that, and I don't know, John, if you've really looked at that to see if they are getting an extra couple of tenths of a point or something every time we do that. But I'm gonna guess when we get our statement, there's going to be some cost.
Oh, I know. I've already got my statements bit me home. So
yeah,
they were available online before I got back. So
yeah, right. Yeah. So I mean, I think that they've really kind of moved. I mean, they want a card for $1 payment, and there are several places where they just say no cash. We don't want cash.
Yeah.
We're seeing that a little bit here, but not to the extent. I'd say there are a lot more cash only locations there than there. And so if you don't have a credit card, you're going to have a hard time doing any transactions in Britain. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So
Interesting.
That's
Ron, one of the things you said is that this year when you were visiting, nobody was supportive of Brexit. What do you account for that?
Well, I think that the economy is pretty stinko, really. In there, we didn't find it to be too much of a problem for us traveling and bringing American dollars. They wouldn't let us spend dollars, and that's a difference. I mean, it used to be that the dollar was accepted anywhere in Europe under any circumstances. That's just not true anymore. And so I think the big problem is that they just are not feeling very good about their economy, and therefore it must be Brexit. And they've got a similar situation with Johnson having kind of been thrown out as prime minister, and now they've got the new guy is in, and they had, while we were there, they had what they called local elections, and we're talking about city council type members in other positions on a local level, and the conservatives just got wiped out. They just were wiped out, and kind of a shock. But that's a reaction to having not gotten anything done. They're very much like we are, and that is uninformed. Very, very few of them understand what's going on in the United States, just like very few of us understand what's going on in England. So, but I found that many of them didn't understand what was going on in England economically either. It's really just about what's going on in their personal life. How's their income? And so from that regard, a lot of people are really, really cautious, and the amount of inflation is staggering. They have been double digits until literally the last few days, when it just came down to, I think, 8.7%. So here we are coming in this morning at 4.6%, and they're double our inflation rate. So that's not a comfortable feeling for anybody. So have they blamed it on the right thing? I don't know. I do think it's probably true that having less access to European goods, and a lot of people complain about paperwork, but just having more paperwork in order to be able to do the importing they used to do all the time, makes it feel as though they don't have the selection of goods, and therefore they don't have as much stuff, which is causing inflation to go up. So that's a part of it. But when you have a chance to study the different pieces of inflation, food, for instance, in the United States, I was just looking that up, and our food prices is a relatively small part of our overall inflation. And that's not so true in England. In England, it's a much larger part of their inflation. So they feel that every time they go to the grocery store. Yeah. It's very straightforward. I happen to be listening to a guy that I respect, who's on Bloomberg quite often, Mohammed Al-Arin. is his name, and you may recognize that. He's, I think, a very good economist. He said this morning that he felt as though England was very close to going into stagflation. In other words, not very much growth, but a lot of inflation. And so that's potentially a real problem for them, worse than it is. And I will say that John and I commented throughout, and as I was down in England as well, it continued to happen. There are empty stores in every little town and village. Lots of empty stores. In some cases, I would say maybe 5%, 10% of them are empty. It looks depressing when you go into a town like that.
John, what are your thoughts on this?
So I'm very intrigued by the cities that are around the seaports that are seemingly thriving in terms of tourism and fishing, and of course just transportation in general. And several of the other towns that were inner country towns are really struggling with their ability to keep people housed. They've got high rates of vacancy, boarded up buildings. And it's very obviously those that are internal, away from the waterways, seem to be the ones that are affected more than those are outside. So that would reflect a change in the economic status of those towns over the last 100 years, because some of them have been fairly well built up and very strong infrastructure. And I think it probably goes back to the boost that happened in the industrial age, where the steam engine and the printing press and the weaving and all of these things that we now take for granted were kind of pioneered in Scotland, and people flocked to Scotland from all over Europe to be part of that new industrial age revolution. And it probably spurted and spurned a couple of 100 years worth of growth. And now some of those areas they have nothing left. There's no new high digital tech going on. There's no new shipbuilding going on of any major size, and so therefore they become stagnant.
And I think John's right. The economy used to be based on rivers, and because of water power. And then, of course, after that, some of these mills and factories were already established in the middle of the country, had a labor force, and so they just simply took steam power into the existing mills, and so it stayed there. And their waterways are really very functional 200 years ago, 100 years ago, with the canal system that they built, and was really allowed them to transfer goods from the center of the country to wherever in order to get to the ports. But because of the change in manufacturing that's happened here as well as was there, with so much of it going to other countries, it's hollowed them out as well. And of course, they have a much different union situation than ours. It's stronger. While we were there were strikes. Transportation was striking, 3 days on the trains, and then 3 days for the airports, and then somewhere else, so you had this constant unsure situation as to which transportation is going to be working at any given time. That is not the way business can thrive. So when you've got
and I'd add on the top of it, because I left New Zealand over 30 years ago, partly because I knew I was a business-centric individual and I wanted to risk my future based on my judgment and the work and teamwork and all that. And I realized that in New Zealand in the 70s and 80s, the government changed the taxation rates on imports. They said, you can import from this country. Oh, you can't import from this country. We're part of Brexit. We're not part of Brexit. We're part of, and all of a sudden you're building a business based on decisions that you make and relationships that you have. And then the government just goes and arbitrarily changes it. What happens to your business? It's gone. And so this is what I see, that England is actually in decline for having wobbled. Whether or not Brexit is a good deal or a bad deal, the wobbling is the problem. Because, okay, we're currently in the situation of Brexit. Well, is that going to last, or are we going to come back? Well, there are thousands of businesses in England that had established relationships based on the European Union
Mhm.
that now are broken, and now Brexit's doing it. I happen to know, and any of those from Australia and New Zealand, we had extremely strong trading ties with England and the European Union for our primary goods. And that all kind of went away when the European Union became strong. And so who do we start trading with? Well, China and Asia. And, so we developed new markets. Well, now all of a sudden, oh, guys, we've come back. We're going to be part of your team again. Well, wait a minute. We've now got long-term relationships.
Right.
So I would say that a lot of business is about risk and reward. And if I'm going to risk something to get a reward, I do not want the government working against me.
Yeah.
And it would appear to me that the government of the United Kingdom, of Britain, is in some sense working against business.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd say their outlook doesn't look that good just because of that.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you a question on Brexit, because that was purportedly a Democratic vote, and I say that in quotes because basically I don't know who pushed what, but it sounds like it's had a dramatic impact on both the economy and perhaps even inflation. Is that an accurate view?
I mean, I think that would be the opinion of the people who I talked to specifically about that is the case. Now, in terms of reality, I'm not really sure that there's been that much. I mean, it's added some, but it's not 8.7% of the inflation problem is not due to Brexit. No.
Yeah.
It's a very small percentage of it, but additional import costs. And I saw several people on the British news, which people simply complaining about the additional paperwork. They're kind of as John was saying, you've got a certain stable relationship, things are working okay. All of a sudden now you've got a whole bunch of new regulation that comes along in the form of filling out paperwork, and you didn't really have the staff to do that. So you got to go find it, buy it, work harder as a small business person to be able to get that to happen. And so now that just adds another overhead issue. So of course you're going to have, and you got to get the money for that somehow, and that's another inflationary thing. But it tends to be a smaller inflationary thing. But I think the sentiment's really changed. Personally, I supported Brexit because it was a movement, sort of a psychological movement of independence. The argument was that you've got people who I didn't elect sitting in Europe, making decisions that are affecting the kind of a vacuum cleaner I can buy. Yeah, okay, I get that. I get that. You vote to get out of Brexit because you'd like to have more independence. You want your own government making these decisions. But there's a price to pay. It may not be in the vacuum cleaner. It's going to be in a bunch of other stuff.
Right. Interesting.
Now, Ron, do they have sales tax there?
They have
They do.
Yeah, it's a value added tax, a VAT tax,
Mm-hmm.
and it's it's a pretty heavy tax compared to our sales tax. There's a way to be able to get some of the things that we bought VAT back. For instance, because we're not part of the country and they don't impose that on visitors. But now you got to fill out a bunch of forms. And I don't know, John, are you going to fill out the VAT tax for the rental cars?
Well, yeah, that's one of the rental cars was kind of pricey, so that might be worth it doing it just for that.
Yeah.
Who knows? You rent a car for a couple of weeks and it adds up.
So you see, I personally think that it would be a really good exercise for you to fill that out so we can get a report on how complicated.
And see, my general sense is, why would I want to go through that pain?
Well, I understand that. That's why I want you to do it. So they do have heavy taxes. There's just no question about that. And so when you take a look at their overall standard of living, it's interesting that their average, I've got the numbers right here. The average size of a home in the United Kingdom is 818 square feet.
Wow.
Wow.
In Ireland, it's 957 square feet. And as you probably know, compare that to the United States, it's 2,164 feet. There's very interesting, it's that you've got Canada, United States, New Zealand, and Australia all punching about right around 2,000 square feet or a little bit higher. And then it drops dramatically. You've got Denmark, Luxembourg at 1,400 feet. So there's a big difference between 1,400 and 2,100. And that tends to just illustrate, the kind of costs. So I'd say that in looking at their real estate, again, this is not a survey, it looks as though their real estate is roughly the same. You can buy a house, say but that's going to be smaller, a lot smaller. So the price per square foot is a lot higher. And you've got housing situations that are not nearly as diverse or attractive as what we have here. And that's partially because a huge percentage of their housing stock is over 100 years old. So they have this incredible historical legacy and culture, which is just infinitely fascinating to me. And John and I participated in an awful lot of that as we toured castles and ruins and that kind of thing. But it's also holding them back because they have to retrofit in order to be able to add, say, modern plumbing. And so the general cost of housing is much higher there. So they're having to kind of deal with a standard of living that is a little bit lower in terms of housing. You could argue, well, you don't really need a place that is you guys in North America or Australia or New Zealand, you guys don't need so much space, or you have a lot more space than we have per capita. Well, that's all true. By the same token, while there is a number of square feet that's probably a little bit excessive, we don't really need to have that. Trying to fit a family in 818 square feet is really tough.
But one of the things going on, though, Ron, and I'm amazed that you overlooked this, is that every little town has this additional room or series of rooms called the local pub. That is an extension to the house, because it was amazing. I mean, I knew about it. I've been there before, but the pubs were full at night on the way home, and the pubs are very elegant, very well positioned. They don't serve food; they serve alcohol, and it was a place for a community, and it was kind of like a everyday church. Sports was going on, dialogue was going on, so that makes up for a little bit of the smaller house, because you have this wonderful pub that you can walk to normally, a couple of blocks, and there it is.
Yeah, well, if you like a house where all your neighbors are in the living room all of the time, I would agree.
There you go. That's right. Yeah.
But some of us like to, read and listen to music and watch TV and other
There
things.
you go.
Besides
So
that.
that was just an irony. I was thinking back on.
But I agree with you. You're absolutely right. They're very active. They're very much a social part. That doesn't exist in our small towns.
No, it does not. It's completely different than what we've got.
I mean, you've got a tavern where all the drunks hang out in a lot of these small towns. I hope I'm not offending any small town.
No, it's not. It's not that.
It's different. It's
different.
Entirely different thing. And their small towns are filled with people that have university educations, good jobs, good craftspeople, educated people. I'm not sure you could compare the mixture of a small town in England to the mixture of a very small town in the United States at all.
So slightly different take. I want to talk about the foundation. I referred to it later, the guarantee that government is not going to step in and change the interest rate, change the euro to the pound, or go back again, change the nature of the banking system. And the ability for people to make 20-year investments. My take on business is, at some point, we all have been in business independently for ourselves. We've all made investments in the future, and we make them based on there being some degree of stability in several variables that we're looking at. We don't expect those variables to change dramatically. Yeah, we'll have inflation, and we don't like it, or we do like it because we thrive on it. But in general, we don't want that to be going up. We don't want the interest rates on our money to be changing. That's why we go to fixed rate mortgages. We don't like variable rate mortgages. And then the land value we've got typically is going up in value. It's not fluctuating. So I can get a loan on my land, and I can then invest in a 20-year project that will come right. And I'm suspicious that one of the reasons that America has, and still is currently, a hotbed for development is because there are a lot of individuals who are prepared to make a 20-year bet. And I say the word bet, it's an educated, metriced business decision based on the variables that are out there. And I bet you there's people in Britain right now who are saying, well, are we going to flip-flop on this thing? I mean, yeah, it's the pound right now, but what happens if we do a variation with the European Union or whatever? So I'm just wondering whether or not they've actually done themselves in a little bit.
Yeah, there are already calls by individuals for a new referendum. And so it's probably a very small chance that would happen anytime soon, but it's in people's minds. It's like, well, let's have another vote on this. This hasn't worked out the way we hoped.
Well, and then everybody who's in business goes, okay, so we're going to change again. Well, let me wait. You know what happens when you got something like that? Oh, I'm not going to put the new plant let's go build that in Paris.
Right.
Let's go build in Spain. At least those guys are stable. We can buy stuff in Spain that we know their regime's not going to change. They're predictable. They're safe, secure, and predictable.
Right.
And
that's an interesting point, John. Were you able to witness more of that? People migrating out of the areas they were in to either urban areas or different places in Europe?
Witnessing wouldn't be the right term. However, there is a trend. That was one of the trends of, if we can't make a living here, there's plenty of opportunities in other countries. And so the current exodus, there is an exodus to other countries still going on.
And there's, they have their own issues with people coming in and going out. It used to be that laborers could come in, and they could come from Hungary and just show up and get a work visa or whatever their documentation is, and start working. We ran into a lot of people from Eastern Europe, but not as many as there were. I think many of them had to go back home. And they have their own immigration problems. Immigration is as high as it's been ever in England right now, illegal immigration.
Well, let's face it, it's like driving from California to Texas, is going from, the UK to France or the UK to Switzerland. I mean, you could drive there. I mean, you just put your car on the channel and you're gone. I mean, it's not a big deal. It's really, Europe is kind of like the United States, except there's some water in between chunks of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was before Brexit.
Before Brexit.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, that's where the strength really came from in the whole EU, is building an economy where you could do all of that. And so you could probably say, well, if you've got England that is not happy, and maybe a couple other countries that have sort of floated this idea, maybe that'll cool off now. But really, I think it has to do partially with how many transfer payments are going between countries. And it used to be that England was paying out, say, this is a guess, or an estimate, they were paying out $1 and getting back 97 cents. Greece was paying out $1 and getting back $1.85. And of course, it was euros. And so we have that same problem in the United States, except since we're all one economy, we don't make a big deal out of it. But until recently, California was paying out a lot more money than it was getting back.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, compare that to Mississippi or Louisiana.
Yeah, they're the recipients of a lot of those.
Right.
transfer payments. And so that same kind of thing's going on. So, if California decided to be another country and stopped contributing, but I'm not sure that that's the same now, because on the homeless front, we have most of the homeless. And so most of the money is coming back to California there. And so I don't know where we are exactly there, but sort of from a philosophical standpoint, you can see that if you have a big piece of an economy, California is on the way to going from 5 to 4 on
Yeah,
the world economy. So, with the big tech that we have really driving the state, it's still growing, even though people are leaving the state all of the time.
right, right.
It's still growing. So that becomes a little bit of an issue there. And so I don't know how the EU reconciles that kind of dissent. It's like we still want to have some independence here about some things that we do, but we don't want to be told that we can't do X. France, I understand yesterday just decided, just like that, we're not having any more flights that are within the country that are less than 2 hours because there's too much pollution. No more airplane flights. So if the flight is less than 2 hours, you're now going to spend 4 or 5 hours on a train. So that just comes as a dictum. What does that do to business? I mean, that's if you're somebody who has two or three offices and you're on the plane every week, an hour and a half, and then all of a sudden now you got to do another, or you're shipping back and forth and you used to use air freight. It's like, well, wait a minute. I mean, that kind of dictum that comes on high without a lot of consideration and a little bit of timing to get ready for it, that disrupts business.
Well, I think to John's point here, and that kind of confirms it, Ron, it's like when the government makes decisions that affect your business, it makes you decide, well, am I going to stay here or am I going to go someplace else?
Mm-hmm.
I just think we've got a situation here that's very similar there. I mean, Brexit had an enormous impact on the economy. How's that going to play out in the long run? I can see people saying maybe we should reconsider this.
It may be. I mean, and they'll have to try and figure out what that really means and let the economists try to determine, what the actual cost was. And I'm not sure if those calculations are long enough yet to be able to make that determination. But it'll end up being some kind of a long-term estimate of where they really are. What are the real costs versus
Right.
what are the real opportunities?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, England is as rich in culture as it is. That won't go away. But its industrial revolution appears to be over, I think, to us, and they're having the same issues with manufacturing that we had. Their service sector has been affected partially by financial services, have been affected by to some degree by this split in Brexit. And the question is going to be in the future as well: are they going to be able to prosper in that particular in the services area? Ireland, on the other hand, by the way, their income is by some measures higher than ours per capita. And they managed to attract dozens and dozens of high-tech companies during that period of time when they got rid of taxes. Those
Right.
loopholes are now kind of filled. They're not as bad. They're not. I shouldn't say good or bad. I'm not sure if they are good or bad. But if they were loopholes, they've gotten rid of some of those, and as a result, the companies that are there have not tended to move. But the interesting thing is that I'm not sure that Ireland is necessarily increasing the standard of living of the people who are there, even though they're making quite a bit more money than, say, in England.
I have a personal attachment to that. My brother had a manufacturing. He manufactured something for bows to straighten arrows, and he had it manufactured in Ireland because he could have it done so much more cheaply than he could have it done here. John, I know you have to leave here. Would you like to, what's your summary of what we've talked about?
So I guess at some point we need to, I mean, every business needs to decide and every country needs to decide, is it going to be allow business, free business to thrive with best practices under the economies that it is trading in? Or are we going to be governed by a political body for the betterment of the people? And there are many examples of that. If you're being a little rough, you'd say, you go back to World War II and say there were some countries who try to dictate what was good for the people. It gets a little nasty, so I won't go there. But I would say we're losing it if government controls the ability for business to invest and to flourish. And I think in California, we're definitely at that edge where government control prevents people with the same mind to be here. There's been so many companies that have left California to go to other states, and so many companies who have set up manufacturing and operations overseas so they can divide the retained earnings, if you will, or the profits, if you will, to keep it out of the clutches of some of the local states. That's how big, really, at the end of the day, where do you want to do business? Where do you want to invest 20 years of your life? Well, I think actually Ireland is set up very well to be doing well under that. And I'd say that Britain is caught in a snafu of what's right and what's wrong. And, you know, they're in a ground spin, I think.
Interesting. You know, if I can push back a little bit on that, you know, we see California losing population, but what they're losing is blue collar workers. What they're gaining is high tech workers who are coming in who can add more to the economy. And I think in part that's why we're going from 5 to 4 in terms of world economies. So, you know, it's an interesting mix. I don't know if that's going to play out in Europe like it has here, but it certainly has benefited us.
I'm not sure I agree exactly with that. I think we're getting a lot of sort of middle income people and a lot of small business people that are leaving.
Yeah.
And when you say we're bringing in high tech workers, most of the companies that may be headquartered here have offices in other places. I mean, Google.
Well, Tesla would be an example of that. You know, I mean,
yeah,
they started here. They would have stayed here, but they basically moved to Texas. You know.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. But we're still moving from number 5 to number 4. So there are factors going on there that are interesting.
Yeah, that's in. But you know, those are forecasts, and that's based on dollars received in companies that are already existing. That doesn't, I don't think that translates into new employment necessarily at all. And much of that new employment is going to, I mean, there are a lot of people who've moved out of the state that still are working for the same companies, but and that the same thing has happened in England. There are a lot of little towns where people have complained, the city folks have all moved out here because they don't have to work in London anymore.
Right.
You know, and so I mean, people want to have a little nicer place to live.
Right.
They don't want to fight what's in cities. So, but then having said that, you know, Silicon Valley is not a city. It's not a high density city like San Francisco. It doesn't have the problems like San Francisco. They could possibly get it to that point if they allow unrestricted building, et cetera, et cetera. But so I think our increase in population is really based on immigration. I don't see that we're doing a lot of hiring and bringing people in from out of state. They can't afford to live here.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah. Well, gentlemen, I know that you have to leave. Thank you. Ed, do you have any thoughts before we wrap this up? You haven't said much.
Well, I've been listening and learning, and it's pretty fascinating to me, the differences between the different countries and how they operate. And I'd love to learn more about family businesses over there compared to here, because that's kind of what we focus in is family businesses. And what are the challenges they have there that compared to our challenges, but operating with so much more risk of uncertainty definitely brings down valuations of businesses and opportunities over there compared to here. One of the great things we have in the United States is stability for the most part, especially hearing some of the stories from John and Ron. So hopefully that continues, because I don't think we want to go the other way. I think we got a lot of advantages here in the United States that we want to keep.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. And maybe next week, as Ed pointed out, we can talk about your perceptions on family business, because I think that's an interesting twist on this. And as John said, or maybe both of you, the pubs are family businesses run out of your basement or downstairs. Really fascinating stuff.
Yeah. You bet.
All right. Thank you, guys.
You bet. We'll see
Thank you.
later.